The knavery of slavery. Africa. Africa, which pursued the internal and external slave trade, had a high rate of slavery. Between 1300 and 1900, over one-third of the people in the Senegambia region were slaves. Approximately one-third of people lived in slavery in the early Islamic states of the Western Sahel, such as Ghana, Mali, Ségou, and Songhai. Black African slaves and their offspring first appeared in European courtly life and nobility in the late 1300s and early 1400s. Beginning with Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, the retinue began to include black Africans. An Ethiopian embassy arrived in Venice in 1402. In Mantua and Ferrara, wall paintings from the 1470s depicted black Africans as court attendants. The Duke of Milan's symbol included black Africans in the 1490s. Slaves from Africa were brought to North Africa during the trans-Saharan slave trade in order to be sold to Middle Eastern and Mediterranean societies. Slaves were brought from Africa to the Arabian Peninsula via the Red Sea during the trade. The slave trade in the Indian Ocean, also referred to as the slave trade in East Africa, was multifaceted. Africans were transported as slaves to the Indian subcontinent, the Arabian Peninsula, the Indian Ocean islands, including Madagascar, and eventually the Americas. These traders transported the Bantu people, Zanj, to the coast after capturing them from the interior of modern-day Kenya, Mozambique, and Tanzania. In rural places, especially on the islands of Unguja and Pemba, the slaves gradually blended in. Between 1500 and 1900, about 5 million African slaves were purchased by Muslim slave traders and transported from Africa across the Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and Sahara Desert. According to some historians, up to 17 million people were sold into slavery along the Indian Ocean coast, the Middle East, and North Africa. All around the Middle East, the captives were auctioned. Better ships increased trade and the need for labor on local plantations, which sped up this trade. Tens of thousands of captives were eventually being abducted annually. The slave trade in the Indian Ocean was multifaceted and evolved over time. Over the course of several centuries, Bantu slaves purchased by East African slave traders from Southeast Africa were sold in significant quantities to clients in Egypt, Arabia, the Persian Gulf, India, European colonies in the Far East, the Indian Ocean islands, Ethiopia, and Somalia in order to satisfy the demand for menial labor. The Sokoto Caliphate's territory were thought to house the world's biggest slave population, approximately 2 million individuals, by the 1890s, according to the Encyclopedia of African History. Slave labor was widely used, particularly in agriculture. In the early 1930s, the Anti-Slavery Society estimated that, of Ethiopia's estimated 8 to 16 million inhabitants, 2 million were slaves. The Bantu and Zanj peoples that inhabited the East African coast were used as slave labor. During the centuries-long Indian Ocean slave trade, Arab traders transported the Zanj to every nation that bordered the ocean. Many Zanj slaves were enlisted as warriors by the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs, and as early as 696, Zanj slaves revolted against their Arab captors while they were held as slaves in the Umayyad Caliphate in Iraq. Enslaved Zanj who had originally been taken from the African Great Lakes region and areas further south in East Africa are thought to have been involved in the Zanj Rebellion, a series of uprisings against slavery that took place between 869 and 883 near Basra in the Abbasid Caliphate, which is located in modern-day Iraq. It eventually claimed more than tens of thousands of lives in Lower Iraq and involved more than 500,000 slaves and free men who were brought in from all across the Muslim kingdom. The Zanj who were sent to the Middle East as slaves were frequently employed in labor-intensive agricultural tasks. Agriculture and other manual labor were viewed as degrading as the Arabs' wealth increased due to the plantation economy. The slave market grew as a result of the ensuing labor scarcity. Captured Christians and Europeans were made into slaves in Algeria's capital, Algiers. Up to 35,000 Christian slaves lived in Algiers around 1650. An estimated 1 to 1.25 million Europeans were enslaved between the 16th and 19th centuries as a result of Barbary slave traffickers' raids on coastal settlements and ships that stretched from Italy to Iceland. However, this estimate is the outcome of an extrapolation that makes the assumption that throughout a 250-year period, the number of European captives taken by Barbary pirates remained constant. Although the exact number of men, women, and children that were enslaved is unknown, it is feasible to estimate the approximate number of new captives that would have been required to maintain populations and replace those who perished, fled, were ransomed, or converted to Islam. Based on this, it is estimated that 8,500 additional slaves were required per year to bring the total number back to 850,000 over the 1580 to 1680 century. By extension, the number might have easily reached 1,250,000 over the 250 years between 1530 and 1780. Other historians, including David Earle, have disputed these figures, warning that the fact that the Corsairs also captured non-Christian whites from Eastern Europe taints the real picture of European slaves. Furthermore, estimates of the number of slaves traded were inflated, using peak years to compute averages for entire centuries or millennia. Because to slave imports and the lack of reliable records before the 1840s, there were significant annual variations, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. During the 19th century, up to 50,000 African slaves traveled through Zanzibar annually under the rule of the Omani Arabs, making it the principal harbor for slaves in East Africa. According to some historians, between 650 and 1900 AD, 11 to 18 million African slaves traveled via the Sahara Desert, Indian Ocean, and Red Sea. The losses suffered by Sudanese slaves being taken to Egypt on foot were detailed by Edouard Ruppel. Nearly 40,000 slaves were captured following the Daftradar Bey's 1822 expedition in the southern Nuba Mountains. However, only 5,000 made it to Egypt due to poor treatment, illness, and desert trek.
Wo
Veenhoven wrote, the German physician, Gustav Nachtigall, who was an eyewitness, thought that 3 or 4 slaves perished en route to a market. Other historians thought that at least 6 slaves perished en route or during the slavers' raid. According to Livingstone, the number is as high as 10 to 1. Kinship structures and the types of slavery used in Africa were closely related. Since land ownership was illegal in many African tribes, enslavement was a strategy employed to broaden one's network and gain more authority. As a result, slaves were an enduring part of a master's family, and slave children might form intimate bonds with their extended families. Slave children born into households had the opportunity to become part of the master's family group and become well-known members of society, sometimes even becoming chiefs. But stigma frequently persisted, and slaves who belonged to a familial group might be strictly separated from those who were connected to the master. In different parts of Africa, slavery was practiced in a variety of ways, including debt slavery, enslavement of war prisoners, military slavery, and criminal slavery. Slavery was common throughout Africa for both domestic and legal purposes. Many local slave systems started providing captives for chattel slave markets outside of Africa when the Atlantic slave trade started. The Atlantic slave trade was the biggest in terms of volume and intensity, although not being the only slave traffic from Africa. The African continent was bled of its human resources via all possible routes, Eliakim Bacalo stated in Le Monde Diplomatique. From the ports of the Indian Ocean, across the Atlantic, via the Red Sea, and over the Sahara, from the 9th to the 19th centuries, the Muslim nations benefited from at least 10 centuries of enslavement. Between 11 and 20 million slaves were shipped over the Atlantic Ocean, for a million through the Red Sea, for a million more through the Indian Ocean's Swahili ports, and maybe as many as 9 million via the Trans-Saharan caravan route. African countries like the Ashanti Empire, the Kingdom of Dahomey, the Aro Confederacy, and the Oyo Empire were usually the ones that conducted these voyages. About 15% of slaves are said to have perished during the journey, with mortality rates significantly greater in Africa during the capture and transportation of native populations to the ships. The greatest number of slaves were taken during raiding operations into the interior of West Africa in the late 18th century, marking the height of the transatlantic slave trade.